Section 8, Government Housing, the Projects, Housing Authority, Subsidized Living. With homelessness rampant in the United States and the cost of living becoming more and more unaffordable, I've wondered why people are not looking towards government housing as a solution to the problems we're facing. How did housing projects begin? Well, today we have shanty towns, or what we know as slums in the United States, places like Skid Row in Los Angeles. Were the reason that housing projects were created, predominantly the African American community. As the United States looked to improve its infrastructure, it considered these shanty towns or inappropriate housing as something that it had to eliminate from its landscape, and thus in the 1930s and 40s began efforts to create public housing to get rid of these smoke towns or shanty towns or slums. Ironically, today we're facing the same exact problem in the United States with homeless camps and slums popping up all over the country. And while many people contribute housing from the government only to urban cores like large cities, there are government housing projects even in rural areas. And while to many people the word government housing in the United States is synonymous with the African American community, we're also going to learn that throughout the country there are many communities that benefit from these programs. But projects, as we know them, or housing complexes in the United States, came about first in the area of Atlanta, Georgia. And as we will see in this video, Atlanta, Georgia, and the adjacent areas still have massive amounts of government housing available to its people. Some people will say to the detriment of these communities, but it's important for us to understand why these buildings came about, why the government gave people free housing, and who was the intended person that should have benefited from these resources. After the 1930s and the Great Depression, it wasn't just African Americans who needed housing. The average Americans also needed housing, and further on after the World Wars, there was a lot of military housing available. Coming out of wars and pandemics, it only made sense that these cities have to find solutions for housing for the urban cores. By the 1970s, that narrative had changed completely, and the name of government housing had also changed. And I want you guys to understand that for this video, when we say government housing, there's subsidized housing, there's Section 8, and there's apartment complexes that are very affordable and today would match the profile of what a housing complex is, being that most of these housing complexes are now being demolished, rezoned, redeveloped, rebranded into apartments. And while most people think it's free bread for the birds, there's actually incentive for a lot of people to have to pay for this housing at a percentage of their income. So as the definition and requirements of government housing change, so does the complexity of what is a housing complex and what isn't. Take a lot of cities like Miami, Florida. They have the historic Liberty Square projects. These projects are now being turned into what could almost be considered luxury apartments. However, the requirements to land in here are not the same as initially, and only the families that had the absolute best standing are going to be able to benefit from moving into the new buildings. While in Miami, government housing is an incredible thing, in other parts of the country like South Alabama, these places are absolutely deplorable. And let's be clear, requirements like no criminal record and some type of real disability are required for the new standards of Miami. The vast majority of people in states like Alabama can quite easily get government housing, even if they're just pretending to have a disability, which leaves people in places like Los Angeles, California, who are homeless quite upset. And Los Angeles, just like Miami, is a place that people pay incredible amounts of money to live in. Unfortunately, these government complexes have become havens for criminals. Why? Why would something that we designed for the elderly, the disabled, and the people who really needed it become a safe place for criminals? When people in these housing projects reach out to the law enforcement asking for help, many times the law enforcement simply does not reply or care to help them. So even if they did try to make police reports, law enforcement doesn't take these areas seriously. Most of the time, these government housing complexes are assigned to this sweet old grandma, and she wants to let her grandkid not end up on the streets, so they end up moving in. Next thing you know, you have a lot of people living in these complexes who are not the designated. Not only do those people go on to commit crimes in their community, they also go on to victimize the people that are hosting them. What starts out as letting somebody sleep on the couch turns into somebody who not only lives in the house, but also becomes very demanding and starts to abuse the person. It's a really sad cycle. With unaffordability reaching high levels, people are even looking at places like Tulsa, Oklahoma as places to live. Cities like this still have a lot of inventory of real estate that's affordable. People are leaving beautiful states like Florida and California, mountains and beaches, to end up in completely barren, horrible places where apartment complexes that are more affordable are playing the role of what government housing used to be in the past. Cities like Tampa, Florida are demolishing most of their government housing. However, there's one project in Tampa that will likely never be demolished, and it is the one we're looking at here in Robles Park, because underneath this government housing complex are the tombs of African American graves. They actually built the projects over African American cemeteries because they knew that African American communities would live in these homes as a sign of disrespect. And a lot of people in the United States have really taken the issue of government housing as a huge reason to become upset. With racial jealousy and inequality being a huge problem in the United States, whatever communities obtain this free government housing are many times left with other utilities like law enforcement or any other type of entity of the government that is ran by another race. You can expect they're not going to support it, and if they do, it's definitely not going to be with good intentions. But today, even cities like Sarasota, Florida, that are very expensive and people from all over the country want to move to these types of places, still have to offer their communities government housing. But the waiting lists are very long, and many people assume that they can just transfer their Section 8 from one state to the next, not understanding how difficult it is even for the locals, the disabled. Imagine the state of Florida where people are sleeping on the streets and people in other states think that they can just move to Florida and have their Section 8 transferred here. They don't provide help for the people that are from here. What makes you think they're going to accommodate for somebody from another state? And in many parts of the country, people just take government housing as a thing that's granted. Take the state of Alabama that has more housing projects in its large cities than anywhere else in the country, and even small towns in Alabama will usually have an incredible percentage of their population living in government housing. And people always ask me, with cities like Birmingham and Montgomery having so many empty and abandoned houses, why are so many people homeless in the United States? The answer is quite simple. You're better off homeless in Miami or Los Angeles than you are in a house free in Alabama. Take the city of Birmingham, who has a murder rate higher than most cities on the US-Mexico border on the Mexican side. Now imagine these housing complexes in cities like Birmingham are a conjunction of most of the poor and most disadvantaged people in these entire states. The idea of trying to knock down government housing and put these people in what they called mixed income housing, it's where they make a new development And among normal housing units, they'll let some people live for Section 8, since having them in communities of high population density turns into very bad crime areas. However, this plan has actually backfired, and as the people that were originally in government housing are moving into other neighborhoods, they're having conflicts with other people in those communities, which has led to an increase in crime in the cities that have implemented this measure, like Louisville, Kentucky. Cities like Birmingham, Alabama are not going to have this problem. The state of Alabama simply is not going to give resources to their poor people. A state that cares more about its cemeteries than what it does about its communities or even its schools. In the state of Alabama, the schools have boarded up windows and old air conditioning units that don't work, while the cemeteries all seem to be perfectly groomed. Their historical importance. Wow. Whew, we're standing up on a hill during a thunderstorm. Scary. So they seem to care more about their historical past than they do about the future of their children. Take the city of Montgomery, Alabama, where the schools are literally falling apart. They're not cutting the grass. They're not taking care of the landscaping. The classrooms have boarded up windows with plywood, air conditioning units that sometimes do not work. This is the conditions of the schools in Montgomery, Alabama. While the schools are falling apart, the state of Alabama keeps their Confederate cemeteries in top condition, well groomed and landscaped. And federal resources that should be being used for education are being used to create new prisons. Realistically, in the city of Montgomery, you can buy a house that's inhabitable for less than $15,000. So when states like Alabama and Mississippi brag about having some of the lowest homeless rates in the country, it's really not a surprise. Many people just assume that government housing only exists in the United States. It exists all over the world, from Australia to Asia to Africa to European countries. And regardless of the race or ethnicity of the people that live in these complexes throughout the entire world, they just seem to not work anywhere. Take the case of the ones in Italy. These are also infamous, just like the ones in the United States, for being some of the worst places to live. The issue surrounding free government housing is not uniquely an American problem. And European countries, for example, like Spain, Italy, all happen to have the same exact problem with free government housing that the United States seems to have. So while many people in the United States are quick to point a finger and turn it into a racial issue, well, they have government housing in Europe as well, and it is plagued with problems just like the American system. In the northern region of Alabama, there's a lot of government housing complexes that are predominantly white. I had never really seen this until I moved to Alabama. And it's understandable that with so many people homeless in the United States, the increasing cost of living, that people would turn to wanting free government housing, or at least subsidized programs to make living easier. Other people are living in states where they really are spoiled, and they think that if they just decide that they want to move to Florida or California because it's sunnier there, that their government housing that's free and issued by the government is also going to come along with them. It never ceases to amaze me how unfamiliar with reality a lot of these people are. Take programs like Habitat for Humanity that we have in South Florida. It is only for people like teachers and other people in the community who have lived here for most of their lifetime, and once they obtain these programs while they own the properties, they're not even allowed to sell them. If they decide to sell them, they have to sell it back to the government. That seems to be a much better program where home ownership or the idea of ownership is part of the process, the places like this in Alabama that people don't own it and they're being scrutinized for anything that they do, many times having to drive older vehicles or just portray like they're disabled, portray like they don't have any money. Some of the requirements to have government housing is actually what's kept these communities down, forcing them not to look to economical progress or to have a family structure. This government housing requirements is what's led to African American families being quite literally destroyed, where the fathers cannot be in the household if they're making money. People living in government housing cannot get good jobs and acquire income because they'll lose their housing, which means that the next generation of people that are from these communities have absolutely no future. So every state implements different laws, different requirements, and they usually lead to the complete destruction of the communities, or in some cases, it really helps people get ahead. Later on in this video, we're going to see some communities that are actually pretty desirable. And yes, they are government-issued government housing projects, but they're actually pretty good communities. But in the case of Alabama, which they've extended these programs to so many people and then given them requirements to ensure that they're never going to be able to get ahead, it's pretty much ensured that most of these government housing communities are nothing more than an endless generation after generation trap. And a program that was designed to help people is actually doing more harm than good. Many times, home buyers and investors also refuse to buy properties or invest near these government complexes because of the reputation they have. And in the state of Alabama, a practice called redlining pretty much ensured that banks will not finance anything in black communities, which to this day has ensured that places like Birmingham, Alabama, where the black communities are, property can be worth $25,000. And as soon as you cross the mountain into the white areas, the same property can be as much as 10 to 20 times more. So a tool that was given to the government to ensure the betterment of the people is today actually being used to the detriment of these communities. And knowing that people living in these communities cannot make income has made these ideal places for people that are involved in illegal activities to want to set up shop in these projects because they know that the people living here cannot have any legal source of income. So more than a tool to escape homelessness, it's pretty much become like a prison that holds these communities down. And living in these quote-unquote free communities is actually increasingly dangerous. Many times, a vast majority of the murders that happen in large American cities are going to take place in these projects. Chicago, Illinois, the area called O Block, is considered by many to be the most dangerous place in the United States. The city of Chicago is known for gang violence, and these government housing complexes are a prime place for criminals to be able to hide. The notorious Caprini Greens, which are no longer in Chicago, were so dangerous that not even law enforcement could enter the buildings. Sadly, many people glamorize these places in popular culture. Take, for example, in Broward County, Florida, many rappers have come from this particular community, and it can even be found on video games today, glamorizing a life of crime. However, the vast majority of people that live in these communities are Haitian immigrants, very hardworking. They go to church on Sunday, and these are really good, hardworking people. It only takes a few bad people to give these communities a bad name. Notice how despite being government housing, people actually plant their own trees, many times tropical fruit plants. A stark difference when you compare it to a place like Mobile, Alabama. These buildings are mostly abandoned. However, there's actually people living in some of these units. So while in Florida people are planting palm trees and making their government-issued housing as decent as they possibly can, in Alabama the mentality is to pretend like you're poor, act like you don't have it, look as broke as possible so they don't take away your free government housing. In Louisville, Kentucky, there's a huge collection of government housing. The vast majority of it, especially on the west end of the city, is predominantly African American, the home of Muhammad Ali as well. While the streets of Louisville are tough, there is still hope. Not everybody that's born in these poor communities stays in them. I went to school in West Louisville, one of the city's poorest neighborhoods, and a lot of the kids that I went to school with, despite coming from a horrible inner city background, today are very successful people. I did live in government housing here, and a vast majority of the people in the complex that I live that we're looking at now were not African American. In fact, we had Sudanese, Cuban, Haitian, and many other countries like Bosnia that were in conflict back in the 90s. Despite most of the people here being from the African continent or from Europe, this place was absolutely horrendous, and over the years, many people were lost. The building that I lived in, we're passing right now to the right, my best friend's dad was killed behind one of these apartments in a robbery over only $20. They were originally from Haiti, and after his dad was killed, I never saw him again. Living in these government housing complexes, your life is always in peril. And whether you believe it or not, in this complex that you're looking at here, over the last 20 years, at least 7 people have been killed. But not all government housing complexes are a complete failure. Take Palm Beach, Florida, that has a lot of violent crime. A lot of the government housing here has actually been really successful. The area faces incredible pressures due to how expensive housing is in South Florida. The housing projects here even have a bronze plaque commemorating why the projects were built, who they were built by. The first step they've done to ensure that these communities are actually safe, even though they're in urban areas, is ensuring that only the real people who should be living here, the senior citizens, are the ones doing it. And of course, giving them the opportunity to fix up their gardens and have some type of pride of ownership. West Palm Beach is a prime example of what government housing should really be. And even though it's quote-unquote government housing, you can see that the people that live here really appreciate what they have now. Coming from places like Cuba or Haiti, they really understand what having nothing is, and they're very thankful for the accommodations they have. We're moving on to Pulaski, Tennessee, where the Klan was founded. An organization that mostly only looks out for the interests of white people. Well, in Pulaski, Tennessee, they pimpin', dawg. You know, Juvie's grandma once said, "I ain't gonna have no evil in this house," so he had to leave the projects and hit the streets with his project chic. However, nothing's more pimpin' than these beautiful projects in Key West, Florida. Yes, I said Key West, Florida. A freaking island. Yes, these people get to live for free or subsidized on a paradise-like island in the Florida Keys with freaking iguanas in their backyard like the Island Boys. And they even copped a chicken like OJ the Juice, man. I gotta say I'm jealous, because if I could live for free on Key West, there's no doubt about it, I would take up the offer. But I'll tell you, it's still the projects, and for some reason, even in a place like Key West, there's a criminal element surrounding these government housing projects. And while every once in a while a lost tourist ventures into here and thinks it's a condo community, they don't know they're in the projects. If you pay close attention, you'll see that even this beautiful, nice project has some really bad things going on. Unfortunately, in Indiantown, Florida, they don't get any beaches. They don't get an island. All they get is some sugarcane to cut. And I've always wondered, in places where the poverty is caused by industries that are powerful and rich, why are the communities there being subsidized by the government and not by the companies who don't give these people any better option? Take Avon Park, Florida. This is a very poor region of the state, and in fact, the people living in government housing here have better conditions than the average working class person. The few industries out here are related to agriculture and the citrus industry, and the poverty of this place is incredible. However, the government housing here is actually pretty nice. The people are friendly, and what I would call apartments are overlooking a beautiful lake that has a beach. Not sure how that works with alligators. Can you imagine working in sugarcane in South Florida and living in these conditions? Is it really the government's responsibility, or should the companies be held accountable? Chattanooga, Tennessee, this place has some of the last real projects. When I say real projects, you got the clothes hangers outside, you got the red bricks, high population density. This place is what projects really are in the United States and what they were, because with many programs that are being implemented, places like this are going to be a thing of the past. These types of government housing buildings have been destroyed in most cities, even places like Louisiana, New Orleans, that had a lot of projects like this are completely gone today. And most likely in the future, all large cities are going to be devoid of real housing projects, being replaced with what we mentioned, the mixed income housing idea. However, while we can be certain that these government housing complexes will clearly disappear from all large American cities and be replaced with more modern apartments, we know that small poor towns in the Deep South will continue to have these projects, but cities like Nashville, Tennessee just cannot have these massive eyesores, relics of the past, endemic to poverty and crime in the core of their cities. And once again, with the idea of jealousy, Nashville, Tennessee is a city that a lot of people want to live in, and people commute for hours to get into the core of Nashville from the suburbs they live in. So imagine the people that are living for free here in the center of Nashville. And just like in many other large cities, these projects are plagued with all types of illegal activity that usually takes place wide open. And we can assume that a fast-growing city like Nashville cannot hold on to these relics forever, and eventually these real projects are gonna have to be replaced with newer, more modern apartments, because the activities that are known to happen in these places continue to thrive. While the initial intention was good, to give disabled people a place to live, the vast majority of these inner city housing projects today are plagued with crime, violence. The future fortunes of these cities seem to be wrapped around the idea of people moving to these towns. So cities like Nashville and Miami that are all competing for the person that's moving really don't benefit from having these large projects in the urban core of their cities. They can make them look like apartment buildings and just kind of cover it up and sugarcoat it a little. Back to Florida, Pahokee, which is far inland of Miami-Dade, it's actually in Palm Beach County. Places like this have absolutely no hope for their housing projects to ever be redesigned, redeveloped, because these are obsolete places in areas that nobody will ever see. So we can assume that places like this could continue to be government housing projects with the same exact structures for many decades to come. What incentive is there for the government to spend millions upon millions in a place that nobody will ever see? And there's projects in majority Hispanic cities on the West Coast as well. I found it interesting that in a faraway place like Phoenix, Arizona, so far from the Deep South, how southern it felt to be in these projects. Only 7% of the population in Phoenix is African American or black, and as you head further west, the demographics of the community change, and these housing complexes are mostly of other races. Going to Gadsden, Alabama, located between Atlanta and Birmingham and two major highway hubs, you think the prosperity would find this place. Well, far from true and far from logical, this region of Alabama is suffering. With population loss, it could be easy to assume that even government housing may have vacancy here, but who would want to live in a place this poor and miserable? Even if it was free, this part of Alabama has the cheapest housing in the entire country, where you can buy a home that's inhabitable for less than $15,000. And as many cities in Alabama continue to lose population, we can assume that there'll be vacancy in plenty of the housing projects here. However, living in these places is extraordinarily dangerous, and your life will always be in peril living here. You couldn't convince me to move into a free government housing in Alabama, even if I was homeless. These places are still crime infested because the state, while providing a structure, a physical building for people to live in, it's not providing the people an escape or an opportunity to do something with their lives. I had a friend who lived in government housing in southern Alabama, and he told me something as simple as going to the Chinese place and bringing home a to-go box was enough to create jealousy among the neighbors and cause you problems in the future. Yuck. Who would want to live in a place that miserable? Alright guys, so let's recap on what we learned in today's video. Not all government housing projects are bad. Some of these places are actually like communities and families where people are putting even plants on government land to make their home a more beautiful place. Some of these places are so miserable you don't even want to get caught with the Wendy's bag, while others are straight up ballin', living on a tropical island. Some of these government housing complexes will not be around for too long as cities are trying to get rid of them. And while you can take the residents out of the project, you just can't take the projects out of the project babies. And many of the cities that are getting rid of the structures still have to deal with the monsters, the people that they've created with their own systems and rules. Only difference now is instead of living in the projects like Project Pat where they were happy, now they're living in mixed income housing next door to you. You can take Kodak Black out of the projects, but you can't take the projects out of Kodak Black. And some of these government projects will be around for decades to come, especially in rural areas that don't have the resources to do something better. And unfortunately, when these government housing complexes are knocked down, they are real communities that will never again be together. They're going to be spread out in different places. And in the case of New Orleans with Hurricane Katrina, even a natural disaster can wipe these communities out overnight. We've also learned that not all government housing complexes in the United States are African American. Many of these communities are white, European, African, Caribbean, or Latin American. And depending on the state that they're living in, the outlook of the future for people living in these projects can be either amazing or very grim. In some of these projects, people showcase their landscaping work, their gardening abilities, or their beautiful vehicles that they've pimped out, while in other communities, the best bet is to keep a low profile. And while the illusion of getting free housing may sound attractive to some, the reality for people living in these places can sometimes be economical hardships, physical disabilities, being looked at as lesser in the community, because let's not forget the stigma that living in these places comes with, and many people that live in these places are just disabled people that don't have any other option, yet society looks at you in a bad way simply because you're not able to have what other people do. And for those dealing with physical disabilities or other ailments, just the fact that they have free housing doesn't mean that they have enough money for all their medications or all the comforts that they deserve as a human being. Over the years, I've worked in a lot of these urban complexes, and the people that I have met are some of the nicest people you'll ever meet, who will share the few things that they have with other people. And in other complexes, some people are so afraid of crime that they're afraid to even speak to an outsider. And there it is, housing projects. An idea that is genuinely well-intentioned, but results that many times are disappointing. And with the increase of housing costs, places like this that used to be abandoned projects are actually getting turned out and becoming brand new apartment complexes. And I wonder if the people who rent out these apartments from other states are aware that their quote-unquote Florida apartment used to be nothing more than government-issued housing. Do you think that one day the nearest housing projects to you could be apartments that people are gladly paying for? It is definitely possible, and it's happening in a lot of American cities. Did you guys notice how in almost every single project we saw a pickup truck collecting scrap metal? And despite the social stigma that these government complexes come with, today many people on social media consider it a badge of honor to be from the bricks, dog. Yes, it's ironic that people have coined terms like Project Baby to designate that they were from the projects as a badge of honor directly from the streets.